Okay, and it just turned to noon, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the discussion of the OMIG's new abbreviated self-disclosure process, brought to you by Schoeneck King and the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General. We have with us today, we are very lucky to have with us today, Elisa Nunziato. She is the manager of the self-disclosure unit at the OMIG. Elisa has been with the OMIG since August of 2010 and has specialized in self-disclosure since 2015. As manager of the OMIG self-disclosure unit, Elisa was involved in the development of the regulation governing the program, as well as the subsequently issued guidance from and updated forms. Additionally, Elisa assisted with in developing the abbreviated self-disclosure process, forms, and published guidance, as well as OMIG's healthcare worker bonus self-disclosure process. My light went off. Elisa has about a 15 to 20 minute presentation, and then after that, we will get into a facilitated questions discussion. We received many questions in advance, and we'll answer those questions that we've received in advance. Any questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We won't have time to answer questions that come up during the presentation, but we'll send those over to Elisa and she'll answer them. We'll follow up after the presentation. And then at the very end of the presentation, there will be a survey. Please stick around to fill out that survey. And we greatly appreciate your feedback. And with that, I will turn it over to Elisa.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I'd just like to let you know that I am joined by Bill Schwartz. He is OMIG's Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations. So if you have any non-specifically self-disclosure related questions, he is available to help answer those. And we would like to thank the law firm of Schoeneck King for setting this up and providing a platform for this additional information to the provider community. We really appreciate feedback from the provider community, especially regarding, specifically for me, especially regarding self-disclosure. Any feedback that we get, we definitely, we look at, we process, and if we have an ability to make things better here with our processes, we try to do that as best as we possibly can. So we just appreciate all the participants today. And without further ado, we'll get started. Just so you know, there will be an additional slide at the end with contact information for those of you that are not familiar with our general contact information for our agency or specifically for self-disclosure. So today, we're going to give you kind of a brief overview of the self-disclosure processes. It's going to be familiar territory for a lot of you. And then we'll dig into the new abbreviated process that I'm sure everybody is very curious to hear more about. So today we're going to start with benefits of self-disclosure. Again, this might be very familiar for some of you, but OMIG's position is that providers should be reviewing their own internal billings and processes. Self-disclosing errors that are found that you've self-identified, we believe that it shows an environment of compliance, that you're doing the right thing, that you're trying to do the right thing. It enables us to work with providers on repayment terms. I'm sure some of you know that the self-disclosure program does have several repayment options for self-identified overpayments, and we try to work with providers as much as we can. And we also just want to stress the fact that it is a provider's obligation to report, return, and explain under federal and state law, statute, regulation, any self-identified Medicaid overpayments. So the self-disclosure processes that are in place provide a mechanism, now two mechanisms for providers to meet and satisfy those obligations. I just want to give a brief overview of some of the common issues that we see across our desks here in self-disclosure. These are generally going to be issues that would be appropriate for the full self-disclosure process rather than the abbreviated process, and we'll get into a little bit more about that later. But a lot of common things that we see are billing errors that have large program or monetary impacts, have impacted a large number of claims, fraudulent behavior by employees, anything that was fraud that impacted Medicaid payments, the discovery of an employee on the excluded provider list when there's a gap between the hire date and when that discovery is made, and those individuals have impacted Medicaid claims in that interim time. Documentation errors, again, things that have impacted, several claims or a large monetary impact. Changes in billing systems that caused claims to be billed incorrectly. We do see that often where somebody will switch their billing system and a glitch happens and it impacts a number of claims. So again, these are commonly seen, but the self-disclosure unit tends to get some of the more rare or odd overpayment reasons as well. We kind of deal with every different pocket of Medicaid. And so we get all kinds of different errors. If you ever have a question about your overpayment or suspected overpayment, we're always available to assist you in helping to determine what your best course of action is. And if it is definitely a Medicaid overpayment, which self-disclosure process fits your overpayment specifically. So with that, we have recently published Part 521.3. It's subpart 3 of the 521 regulation, and that governs the self-disclosure unit. It was, I would say, the most comprehensive overview of the program and processes, and the most comprehensive update that the program has had since its inception. With that, we codified in state law and regulation the federal rule for 60-day report, return, explain. So as you know, if you self-identify a Medicaid overpayment, you have 60 days from that identification period, from that date, to self-disclose that Medicaid overpayment. And that satisfies your report return, and then it's told, and then you repay. And that's the full process. When we were reviewing our regulation and hearing feedback on our regulation, it came to light that there were a number of different types of voided or adjusted overpayments that historically had not been self-disclosed. And these were sort of bucketed out in our review, and we were looking at the ones that are really more routine or transactional in nature. So I can give an example, things like credit balance overpayments, or NAMI claims, where adjusting the claim is kind of just part of the natural life of the claim. Things that were overpayments and had to be returned through void or adjustment, but weren't necessarily something that a provider could prevent from recurring. And even things like, oh, I hit the wrong key and I've miscoded this one claim. We heard from the provider community, and we agreed that these would not be necessarily appropriate for that full-blown self-disclosure process, because it's intense. We ask for a lot of information. We have a lot of back and forth with the provider that's disclosing. And it's a lot for something that would be considered routine or transactional. So OMIG developed the abbreviated self-disclosure process, and that's what we're going to concentrate on mostly today, is just an overview of that. The abbreviated process is very specific. It is for fee-for-service only claims that have been voided or adjusted and would be considered routine or transactional, things that may not need a full-blown corrective action plan. But the development of this process is going to enable providers to satisfy their obligation to report, return, and explain. Because voiding and adjusting does report it to Medicaid, and it does repay Medicaid, but it doesn't explain why that occurred, what happened to cause that overpayment. So this process is going to assist providers in satisfying that obligation. So we now have two different paths for self-disclosure. We have the full process, which most of you are probably very familiar with. And that really hasn't changed since we updated everything in February with our new forms and our new guidance. And now we have the abbreviated process. And just as an aside, we did put out guidance that the first full month of reporting for the abbreviated process will be September of 2023, which we're in right now, and that those reports are due by October 5th. So as we move farther into this presentation, just keep that in mind. So either process, anytime you have an overpayment, it all starts with investigating on your end why that overpayment occurred. You realize you've had a Medicaid overpayment and you want to fully investigate that. You want to identify why it happened, who may have been involved in it, who discovered it, how much that overpayment was. All of that goes into the identification. Identification is defined in our regulation and our guidance. My team and I are happy to provide that definition to anybody that asks. It's kind of a sticking point from a lot of the providers that we've engaged with since our regulation was published. What it really means is that you have fully investigated the error that occurred. You've figured out why you received that overpayment, and you've quantified that overpayment to the best of your ability. So this slide is going to give you a few different examples of what types of overpayment would be appropriate for the full process and what might be appropriate for the abbreviated process. Please know that this information is also published in our FAQs run on our website, and that my team is available to assist providers at any time if they have questions about their specific overpayment reason to help you determine which process is appropriate for you. Again, I'll just go over it briefly. The full process are all the reasons that you're used to, systemic issues, fraud, overpayments stemming from fraudulent behavior, overpayments that involve maybe more than one entity. And the example that we give for that is like the health home care management agency relationship. Any errors that have a substantial monetary or program impact, those are all going to be appropriate for the full process. Again, the abbreviated process is specifically for fee-for-service claims that are being voided or adjusted and that are considered routine or transactional in nature. This is just a flow chart, this slide, a different way of looking at how you go about determining which process is right for you. So I've identified I have an overpayment. I'm now going to investigate that overpayment and figure out what happened and try to quantify it. And then I'm going to determine which process is appropriate for self-disclosure of that overpayment. So submitting a abbreviated self-disclosure. The full self-disclosure process is posted on our website. It's something most of you are used to. We have several forms, claims, spreadsheets as appropriate that are available for submission. The abbreviated process is a little bit different. Once you identify that you have an overpayment and that it's appropriate for the abbreviated process, what we heard from the provider community through our engagement while we were developing this process is that the vast majority are seeing they have an overpayment and then they're going to void or adjust it. It happens pretty close together. It's really in the same identification time frame. So if you have a claim that's been overpaid and it's appropriate for the abbreviated process, the first thing you're going to want to do is void or adjust it. Then you're going to want to document it. And we've heard that most of you are already doing this. The abbreviated process right on the website is two parts. There's the original link that you click on is going to bring you to a contact sheet where you're going to fill out all your contact information. And then it invites you to upload an Excel spreadsheet, which is kind of the meat of the form. It's going to give us all the information that you're reporting. That spreadsheet is available to you on the website to save to your computers and fill out as you go along, as you're identifying and voiding or adjusting, what you're going to want to provide to us, what's in that spreadsheet, is the overpayment reason why that claim or that group of claims was overpaid. We're going to ask you for the identification time frame or date. We're going to ask you for the TCNs, the transaction control numbers for those claims. So what we recommend, because you have to submit the self-disclosure within 60 days of identification, is that this abbreviated process, for those of you that are consistently identifying these small routine transactional types of overpayments, which is a normal part of your billing processes, that you utilize this form, you fill it out monthly, and then you submit it by the 5th of the month for what was voided or adjusted in the previous month that fall into this bucket. That way you'll always meet your 60-day obligation. The form is right there for you to document everything that you're probably already documenting internally. And then you'll be able to submit it by the 5th of the month, and you'll be covered for those that were done in the previous month. If you go in and look at the sheet and you have any questions about filling it out, if you have any issues with submission, again, my team and I are here to help, and we're happy to go through those steps with you and help you figure it out. Full self-disclosure has not changed much in the past few months. All of those forms are still available right on the website. And please keep in mind that voiding or adjusting claims that are going to be reported in the full self-disclosure process is still absolutely okay. In the self-disclosure unit, voided or adjusted claims, we actually see them as a much cleaner way to repay Medicaid. It cracks the record. We verify that. So you're going to still want to void and adjust those prior to submitting your full self-disclosure, or indicate in your documentation that you are in the process of voiding or adjusting those claims so that we can verify those transactions processed through appropriately for you. One question we hear a lot is, what shouldn't be self-disclosed? So this is going to count for both the full and abbreviated process, but anything that is already encompassed in another review, an audit, an investigation, any type of review by OMIG or another agency that is going to recover on those claims, all of those should not be self-disclosed. They're already encompassed in a different review. You don't need to self-disclose them. If it's part of, if your claims happen to be part of like a retro rate adjustment, any type of broader state-initiated transaction, cost settlements, or another payment adjustment mechanism, none of those need to be self-disclosed. There are going to be recovered under that other mechanism. And the only other type of claim error that we will not be able to correct here at OMIG is an underpayment. Underpayments need to be rebilled, and they're kind of subject to their own regulations and rules. So you're going to want to contact eMedNY for any underpayments. Repayment options. It's always a popular topic in our unit. So I know I went over this a little bit already, but voiding and adjusting overpaid claims is absolutely encouraged. We feel it is the cleanest way to repay Medicaid, and it is absolutely acceptable for a full self-disclosure. It's required for claims being disclosed under the abbreviated process. The abbreviated process, again, is for fee-for-service claims that are routine or transactional in nature. The error that caused that claim to be overpaid is routine or transactional, and those claims have to be voided or adjusted to be reported through the abbreviated process. The full process, however, has a few other different repayment options. So once your review is finalized under the full self-disclosure process and we have a verified overpayment amount, you can pay via void or adjustment. You can, and those should be done again prior to the overpayment amount being verified. We want to make sure that those have transacted through appropriately for you. But you can also pay by lump sum check. You can pay by money order. You can pay through electronic payment. And for larger overpayments or payments that will not be feasible financially for a provider to pay in a lump sum, those we do offer extended repayment. In our new forms, we have an area where you can indicate that you believe extended repayment will be needed, and we'll work with you. Our agency, our Office of Counsel, and my unit will work with you to determine those repayment terms and get you set up with an extended repayment plan if needed. Next, we're going to dive into some self-disclosure best practices. And I think we've already touched on a lot of this, but just to reiterate, when you find that you have a Medicaid overpayment, the very first step you're going to want to take is to identify that overpayment. And that starts with investigation. You want to try to determine how that overpayment occurred, what caused it to occur, identify, if you can, who is involved in that overpayment or causing it to occur, who was involved in discovering that overpayment. And then you want to try to quantify that overpayment to the best of your ability. That all goes into the identification of that overpayment. Additionally, if it's something that requires corrective action, the full self-disclosure process, we're going to ask you what that corrective action is. And we are going to expect that you explain that to us so that it's on record what you're going to do to make sure that overpayment doesn't recur. For routine or transactional overpayments, that may not be applicable. Once you've identified your overpayment, you've investigated it, you know about how much it is, you know why it occurred, then you're probably ready to determine which self-disclosure process is appropriate for you, either the full self-disclosure process or the abbreviated process. And once again, myself and my staff are more than happy to answer any case-specific questions that you might have. So a quick reminder that that 60-day clock that you have between your identification date and the date that you self-disclose, it starts at identification. Once you've identified your overpayment, so you know why it occurred, who was involved, and you've quantified it to the best of your ability, that's when your 60-day clock starts. If you are self-disclosing it through the abbreviated process, because that's most appropriate for your overpayment, you are voiding and adjusting it, and that's repaying. So if you submit that abbreviated self-disclosure form within 60 days of that date, you have satisfied your obligation. If you're self-disclosing through a full self-disclosure process, repayment's going to take a little bit longer than 60 days normally. It is intensive. We do ask for a lot of information, but once you submit that self-disclosure, your 60-day clock pauses. They call it tolling in the regulation. It really just means it pauses while we review, we work with you. And then once you get your stipulation agreement, self-disclosure and compliance agreement for extended repayment, or your determination notice, that clock will start ticking again until you repay. All of our forms, all of our uplinks, secure uplinks for submission, our guidance, our regulation, our FAQs are all available for both the full self-disclosure process and the abbreviated process right on our website. If you have any trouble finding this, again, my staff and I are happy to help, and our contact information will be in the next couple of slides. And this is just a reminder that OMIG does expect providers to review their billings internally, to follow their compliance procedures and requirements. And if you identify an overpayment, to self-disclose it because it's the right thing to do. And it also shows us that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Our contact information. If you have questions specific to the self-disclosure processes, myself and my team are reachable by email. We're also reachable by phone. If we don't pick up, please leave a voicemail. We do our best to get right back to people. If you have a question that's more appropriate for email, I triage that box myself, and my team goes in there as well. So our team isn't big, but we do try to answer every question thrown our way. And if you do have any questions, we're happy to help. And then this last slide that I believe is going to be made available to you are the agency contacts if you have any non-self-disclosure questions. So I think, Jackson, I am going to kick it back to you. That is the end of my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. That was very informative. Now I will kick it over to Roger, who's an attorney with Schoeneck King, to facilitate the next portion of this presentation.
Thanks so much, Jackson. And Elisa, I think you're still in your slides. It's if you want to stop sharing. Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you. So just a couple of introductions, and thanks very much to Jackson Soames, who's an attorney in our Rochester office, for kicking this off. Thanks to Gabe Oberfield, who is an attorney in our New York City office, who is responding to some of the chats that are coming through, and to John Darling, who's also in our Rochester office. And I'm in our Albany office. So Schoeneck does have a lot of experience, decades of experience advising providers with respect to OMIG requirements, and we're certainly happy to help provide advice and to confirm a couple of procedural elements that came through the chat. Yes, we will distribute OMIG slides after this presentation. In addition, the webinar will be made available on Schoeneck's website. We will send a link when it's available. I think it usually takes about a day or so for that to effectively upload. And thanks most especially to Elisa and Nziato and the OMIG for being here. Certainly want to support your mission in providing timely updates, and certainly with the upcoming, I think October has a 5th of the month coming up this month, right? So that'll be the first opportunity for folks to avail themselves of this new process. So this is certainly an incredibly timely presentation that you're offering. So as noted, we did receive some questions in advance, and I'm going to kind of walk through some of those and have a little bit of a conversation. Some additional questions are coming through the chat room. We'll make a note of them, scrape the chat room, get them to the appropriate folks to get answers to, and get those back to people. I will maybe just near the end sort of narrate what those questions are, so if people are thinking they have similar questions, know that you're not alone. So the first question that came through in the registration process is there any dollar threshold which should immediately identify something as either a self-disclosure or a void for documentation purposes and for the compliance policy that a provider might have?
There is no dollar threshold. OMIG has developed and published scenario-based identification examples to help providers determine which self-disclosure process is appropriate. Voiding or adjusting is always a repayment option. It's required for the abbreviated self-disclosures, but there is no dollar threshold. All overpayments that are self-identified must be self-disclosed.
Very helpful, thanks. And a somewhat similar question, I think, that came through is, will OMIG be changing the protocol regarding a self-disclosure needing to be completed for any amount of the overpayment? Is the answer to that?
Pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks so much. And then I think this is maybe reflective of some of the confusion out there, but we had another question that came through. Would it be correct to state that if the claim has to be voided or adjusted, then we must self-disclose? However, if we can document the issue, amend the billable progress note to reflect human error that does not impact the claim, that's sufficient. So that's once again another way of, I guess, saying, if we've documented it internally, do we have to self-disclose under this process? And I'm going to hazard the answer is?
Well, that one's a little more extensive, I think. We appreciate that providers are documenting internally, and it's what they're supposed to be doing. But if you've been paid for a Medicaid claim and find it was incorrect and you have to return the money through voids or adjustments, that's an overpayment. And it should be either fully self-disclosed or abbreviated self-disclosed.
I think in our conversation in advance, I think you emphasized the requirement of explaining. Is that right?
Yes. So voiding or adjusting a claim, it does repay and it does report, but it doesn't provide the explanation. And part of the law that governs Medicaid overpayments is that you have to report, return, and explain.
So that's kind of the guiding principle that would help people resolve that kind of question for themselves. And then there's a question which I think anticipated your presentation, but it may bear some repetition. The difference between documentation errors that require a full disclosure versus human error that can be handled through the abbreviated statement. And then there's a sort of second part to that same question, which is asking for an abbreviated statement by the self-disclosure statement by the 5th of the month, but there's a 60-day requirement from identification. So how do you reconcile those two timelines?
So the overpayments do have to be, the self-disclosure for an overpayment does have to be submitted within 60 days of identification. Our best practice recommendation for the provider community that's going to be submitting an abbreviated statement is to do what you're doing. Void and adjust as you identify these overpayments and document them, but utilize our form and submit those by the 5th of the month for anything that you have voided or adjusted in the previous month. That would fall into that form as the appropriate way to self-disclose.
This may help clarify one of the questions that did come through the chat. It's the date of identification, not necessarily the date of service. That would be the relevant submission for the 5th of the month succeeding the identification. Is that correct?
Absolutely. For overpayments, it's the identification date that starts your 60-day clock.
Okay, great. And then there's a partial question that came through that the question that came through was adjusting claims to fewer units needs to be reported. I'm guessing that means, do I still have to do this if the adjustment is to fewer units, not to some other element that an adjustment may be made for?
Yes, any type of overpayment, even if you're voiding or adjusting to correct, does need to be self-disclosed.
And an additional question is, I think unique to the probably the developmental disability sector, because it has to do with life plans. So the question is this: I'd like specific examples of the OMIG's expectation of when to notify them of a payback. Life plans have an effective date and remain in effect until a new life plan is finalized. A failure to finalize or review a life plan within the required timeframes may result in billing disallowances and fiscal auditing. Are you seeing self-disclosure? So, that I'm sort of narrating, and as described, is the question understandable to you? And do you think you might hazard an answer?
It is. We do see several different types of claims that over the natural life of the claim, adjusting or avoiding overpayments is just part of it. We do still expect that those overpayments be self-disclosed. The identification date still applies. And we, of course, want you to follow all of the rules and regulations and policies of your oversight agencies for your different types of services.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a more general question, which I think is broader than self-disclosure itself, but it's really asking the question of ways of measuring the effectiveness of compliance programs, policies, or trainings. Obviously, in the regulations, there's a requirement of that the programs not only be in existence but also be effective. And so I think there is some interest in understanding if there are recommended ways of making that demonstration.
So it's my understanding, and compliance is not my expertise, but it's my understanding that there is a self-assessment tool that's been published, and there is extensive guidance and information that's been published on OMIG's website for the compliance program regulation updates. And they're also available in the compliance unit to answer any specific questions about compliance requirements.
And maybe that could be something, if it's a broad enough felt question, that we might invite somebody from the compliance unit if to help that with folks if there's a broad interest in that. And then the last of the questions that came through the registration process was, could you please specify whether overpayments identified subject to a RAC audit where Medicaid was the secondary payer would fall under these disclosure requirements if the provider intends to appeal the finding?
So while I'm familiar with that specific scenario, my answer is pretty broad. If you have an overpayment that is already encompassed in another review, even if it is pending appeal or anything like that, we consider it already encompassed in another review and it is not appropriate for self-disclosure. It will be reconciled through that existing review.
Wonderful. And one item that did come up in the chat, which I think is encompassed, is really what the effective date of these requirements are, because there was a question about so when does this start? And because obviously people are dealing with things that happened now and things that happened before now. So I don't know if there's a kind of a general guidance you might be able to give to people about when this is effective and now, but when was it effective?
That's understandable. We did publish guidance that stated the first full month of reporting for the abbreviated process is September of 2023, with those reports due by October 5th. So although our regulation was published in December, we recognize that this process was not implemented until after that. So September 2023 is the first full month of reporting expected.
Wonderful. So I hope that's helpful to folks as they're considering their submissions for October 5th. I think there's a couple of much more specific questions that, as I said, we will scrape and we'll get to folks for answers. We also would plan to circulate, as I said, the slides and as well as post onto the Bond, Schoeneck, and King website a copy of this webinar presentation along with this live dialogue. I guess it's just upon me to say thank you so very much to Elisa Nunziato and to the team at OMIG for bringing this information forward, for allowing us to share this information with folks. And obviously, we look forward perhaps to subsequent conversations and opportunities to bring this forward. And I do see some folks in the chat room saying, yes, we will make note of the chat room questions and get some answers to you. So for now, we're going to wish you all a very pleasant afternoon.
Roger.
And, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I apologize. I'm not on camera. This is Bill Schwartz. I was introduced earlier. I just wanted to, on behalf of OMIG, thank Bond, Schoeneck, and King again, and all the participants. We welcome and encourage providers, law firms, associations to reach out to us. There is it benefits not only the provider, but it really informs our work. Because of course we can't fully understand what's going on in the field unless we hear about it. So I wanted to say that first. I also wanted to mention, I believe on the contact slide, there's a link to OMIG's listserv. For anyone on today's presentation who's not subscribed to our listserv, I encourage folks to do that. We put out information, updates, guidance. These are announcements, and it'll have all the links embedded so you can learn more about what we're announcing at that point. My last announcement is I encourage folks next week. I anticipate Monday. OMIG's annual report for 2022 will be posted. It is a statutory requirement that we do an annual report, but we take, it's not just because we have to do it. We feel it's very important to be transparent and detail, our activities for the previous year. And you folks can also look forward to having a reconstituted comprehensive work plan on our future activities coming out, I would say, early in January. So I just wanted to make those few announcements. Again, thank you so much to the team. Great job setting this up. This was among the most seamless presentations we've done, so we appreciate that. And I thank you.
And that tells me my last shout out should go to Kathy Purdy in our marketing department, for whom one can give the credit for the seamlessness of this presentation.
Absolutely.
And
Kathy can take the rest of the day off. Congratulations,
Absolutely.
Kathy.
Absolutely. So be well, everyone, and have a pleasant rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.